The fastest piston-engine fighter in history, capable of flying at tremendous speeds even on a single engine. The German Arrow, the Dornier Do-335, was supposed to close the skies to the Allies, but instead became the primary victim of the Third Reich's cabinet intrigues. What tricks did Claudius Dornier have to resort to in order to bypass the categorical bans of Hermann Göring? How did Willy Messerschmitt copy the blueprints of his direct competitor? And why did these fully combat-ready machines ultimately never fire a single shot? We will uncover the secrets of archival confrontations and analyze the hidden design features of this aviation masterpiece. Watch this episode to the end. The final revelations will make you look at the history of aerial warfare in a different way. Let's go! There is a museum in Washington. It is one of the most visited in the world, the National Air and Space Museum. Families come there, school groups take tours, and tourists take photos of rockets and capsules. Most pass by one particular exhibit. It stands in a corner, not the biggest, not the brightest, but those who stop near it for a long time, as a rule, do not leave quickly. This is the Do-335. The Germans called it the Pfeil, which translates to arrow. The first thing that catches your eye is that the airplane looks wrong. Not in the sense that it is poorly made, it looks as if someone broke a rule that everyone else considered sacred. A conventional airplane has one engine in the front, or two on the wings. Here, the engine is in the front, and there is another one in the back. Two propellers. One pulls the machine forward, and the second pushes it from behind. The fuselage is elongated, almost needle-like. The tail unit is cruciform, like the fletching of a bolt from a medieval crossbow. You stand next to it and think, how does this thing even fly? It did fly. And it flew so well that to this day, no production aircraft with a piston engine has officially exceeded its speed figures. 765 kilometers per hour. This is not a theoretical calculation or a number from a promotional brochure. This is a recorded test result. The year 1944, a piston engine without jet thrust. To understand the scale, a modern commuter train travels at about 100 kilometers per hour. The Do-335 covered that distance in less than 8 minutes. And this is where the story begins that still puzzles aviation historians. Because this machine, with such characteristics, such a design, and such potential, was never mass-produced. It did not participate in a single real combat mission. Only 14 examples were built. 14, and that was it. One of them stands now in that Washington museum, quietly, under artificial light, with a plaque that most visitors do not read to the end. Why this happened is not a simple question. There is no single culprit or single cause here. There is a specific man who designed this machine. There are years of struggle, not with technical problems, but with people. There is a competitor who did not play by the rules. And there are decisions made at critical moments by the wrong people. But to understand how all of this converged at a single point, we must start from the very beginning. Not with the airplane, with the man who designed it. And we will have to start not where you would expect, not with aviation or fighters, but with water. Claudius Dornier was born in 1884 in the Bavarian town of Kempten. His father was a French merchant, his mother a German. This mixture of cultures, oddly enough, was reflected in his engineering mind. He was never tied to a single school of thought or tradition. He took what worked from anywhere. In his youth, he studied to be a civil engineer, not an aeronautical one, but structural. Bridges, structures, loads, materials. This foundation would later manifest itself in everything he did. His airplanes always possessed that special structural logic that many pure aircraft designers lacked. In 1910, he joined the factory of Ferdinand von Zeppelin, the very same creator of airships. Dornier was young and unknown, but Zeppelin quickly realized that before him was a man with a rare gift, the ability to see a structure as a whole rather than in parts. Within a few years, Dornier was leading his own department and working on something he had become seriously passionate about: flying boats. A flying boat is an airplane that takes off from and lands on water. Its fuselage is designed like the hull of a boat. It must stay afloat, withstand the impact of waves, and not break apart when landing on rough water. This is a completely different engineering challenge compared to a conventional airplane. and it was here that Dornier encountered the problem that would later change everything. When two engines were placed on the sides of a flying boat, they caused issues. During landing, water spray got into the motors. During takeoff, the lateral positioning created asymmetrical thrust, pulling the machine to one side. Dornier began looking for a different solution. He watched the water. Literally, he stood on the shore and watched how boats cut through the waves. A narrow hull, minimal resistance, straight-line movement. And then an idea came to him that seems obvious only after someone else has already thought of it. What if the engines were placed not on the sides, but one after the other along the axis of the fuselage? One in front pulling, one in back pushing. No lateral displacement. No spray on the side motors. Perfect symmetry of thrust. He called this the tandem layout. On water, it worked. Dornier began using it on his flying boats, and the machines immediately became easier to handle. That was when he had the idea. What if we applied the same logic to a land-based aircraft? By that time, Germany had signed the Treaty of Versailles, which severely restricted German aircraft manufacturing. Building military aircraft was forbidden. Dornier found a simple way out. He just left, to Italy. There, he established a subsidiary company and continued his work without restrictions. It was there, in Italy, that he created the flying boat that brought him world fame. The Dornier Do-335, commonly known as the Wal, which means whale in Spanish. The machine proved so successful that its license was bought by Spain, Japan, and the Netherlands. The Soviet Union purchased several units directly. The Wal was used for transatlantic flights. It was not a warplane, but a true workhorse of long-range aviation. And all the while he was building flying boats, the tandem concept remained in his head. It grew. It became more complex. It acquired details. In 1937, Dornier filed a patent. The project received the designation P.59-04. On paper, it was already a fully realized airplane, with two Daimler-Benz engines producing 1,250 horsepower each, armor protection for 3 key sections, and a cruciform tail unit that prevented the rear propeller from striking the ground during takeoff and landing. The calculated speed was 755 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 5,000 meters. This was 1937. The best production fighters of that time flew at speeds between 450 and 500 kilometers per hour. Dornier looked at his blueprints and knew, this works. Now he had to convince everyone else. The year 1940. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, is at the peak of its confidence. France capitulated in 6 weeks. Poland fell even faster. An atmosphere reigns in the headquarters that is difficult to describe as anything other than intoxication with success. Why change anything if everything already works? It is at this moment that Claudius Dornier arrives with his project. He was not a naive petitioner. He was 56 years old, with dozens of completed aircraft behind him, a global reputation, a patent, and full calculations. He did not come with an idea. He came with a finished solution. Documents, blueprints, characteristics. Everything prepared, everything calculated. The response was short. No. The official position sounded something like this. The Air Force has enough modern equipment, new developments require time and resources, and priorities have been set. Behind this phrasing stood something more concrete. The personal preferences of the man who controlled all German aircraft construction at the time. Hermann Göring had led the Luftwaffe since its inception. He was not an engineer or a pilot in the technical sense. He was a politician in military uniform. He was interested in victories, numbers, and reports of success. In technical matters, he relied on one man, Willy Messerschmitt. This was not just a working relationship. It was an established system. Messerschmitt received orders, resources, and priority. In exchange, he delivered results that could be shown to the leadership. Dornier did not fit into this system. He was too independent, too persistent, and most importantly, he offered a solution that no one had requested. Göring was looking toward jet engines. This was his obsession. The future of aviation lay in jet propulsion. Everything else was secondary. He considered piston-engine machines to be yesterday's news, no matter how impressive their characteristics were. He wanted speed through jet thrust, not through the engineering elegance of the tandem layout. Dornier left with a rejection. But he did not destroy the blueprints or switch to another project. He put the folder in his desk and waited. Because he understood something that those in the headquarters did not. War rarely goes according to plan, and the moment when his machine would be needed was bound to come. That moment arrived 2 years later, and it came from where it was least expected, from the other side of the English Channel. The British de Havilland Mosquito aircraft appeared in the skies over Europe in 1941 and immediately became a headache for German aviation. It was fast, about 650 kilometers per hour. It flew high, and what was particularly irritating, it was made of wood. The radars of the time had trouble detecting it, and intercepting it at high altitudes was extremely difficult. The Mosquito was used for reconnaissance and high-speed raids, reaching places that conventional aircraft could not access quickly enough. In the Luftwaffe headquarters, they began to panic. An aircraft was needed that could catch up with the Mosquito or outrun it. Fast, high altitude, and capable of operating without escort. And then a painful truth emerged. No such aircraft existed. None of the priority projects funded and promoted over the previous 2 years solved this problem. A competition was announced. The requirements: a high-speed aircraft for interception and reconnaissance. The participants: several leading aircraft manufacturing enterprises in Germany. Dornier pulled the folder out of his desk. When Dornier took out his folder, it was already 5 years old. The 1937 patent, the calculations, the blueprints, everything that had been returned to him with a polite rejection in 1940. But he did not just take the old project and present it again. He was smart enough to realize that going back with the exact same proposal was pointless. He had to speak the language of the customer. And the language of the customer had changed by 1942. Goering was still dreaming of jet engines. This was his fixated idea. The future of aviation belongs to jet propulsion. Everything else is secondary. He viewed piston aircraft as outdated, regardless of how spectacular their performance was. Dornier knew this, and he made a move that says more about him than any technical document. He reworked the project. He kept one of the 2 piston engines in place, in the front, and in the tail section, instead of the second piston engine, he proposed placing a jet engine. The result was a hybrid, a traditional piston engine with a tractor propeller in front and jet thrust in the rear. Technically, it was a viable concept, but the main point was not the technology. The main point was that the document now contained the word jet. This was not outright deception. Dornier was indeed working on a hybrid scheme. It made sense as a transitional solution. But he understood perfectly well that this specific word would open doors that would otherwise remain closed. An engineer with 50 years of experience knew. Sometimes the task is not to come up with the best solution, but to present it correctly. The 1942 competition gathered several participants. The Junkers Company, one of the main manufacturers for German aviation. The Arado Company, famous for its developments of jet aircraft. And Dornier. The difference between the participants was fundamental. Junkers and Arado came with concepts, that is, ideas that still had to be realized. They needed time for development, prototype construction, and testing. Dornier arrived with a project that had 5 years of calculations and refinements behind it. He needed time only to build the first machine. In the competition, this became the decisive argument. The military leadership in 1942 could no longer afford the luxury of waiting. The strategic situation had changed, to put it mildly. The Mosquito continued to fly where no German interceptor could reach. Each month of delay had a real cost. A project that could be launched quickly was worth more than an ideal project that would be ready in 3 years. Dornier won. This was not just a technical victory. It was a vindication for the man who, 5 years prior, had been sent home with his folder. He was 58 years old, and he had just won a competition against companies considered the backbone of the German aviation industry. Immediately after the results were announced, full-scale work began on the machine, which received the official designation Do-335. The hybrid layout with the jet engine in the tail was quite quickly abandoned. The engineers returned to the original tandem concept with 2 piston engines. It was more reliable, easier to manufacture, and, importantly, provided better performance characteristics than the hybrid. In the end, the jet engine never appeared on the Do-335. But it had done its job. It opened the door. However, it was too early to celebrate. Winning the competition meant one thing. Now Dornier had a very formidable enemy. A man who was accustomed to always winning, and who did not know how to lose at all. Willy Messerschmitt was 20 years younger than Dornier. He was born in 1898 in Frankfurt, became passionate about aviation in his youth, and by the age of 30 was already building his own airplanes. He was talented, that is indisputable. His machines flew, and they flew well. But there was something in him besides talent that distinguished him from most engineers. Messerschmitt knew how to work with people in power. This is a distinct art, completely unrelated to the ability to design wings or calculate loads. You need to know whom to call, what to say, and how to present your work so that the right person feels it is their idea, their victory, their success. Messerschmitt did this masterfully, and that is why, by the early 40s, his enterprise received contracts, resources, and priority that no one else had. When Dornier won the competition in 1942, it was a blow to the system that Messerschmitt had built over the years. It was not just a loss in a fair competition. It was a signal that his monopoly on the customer's trust was not absolute. It showed that someone else could come along with a different solution and win. Messerschmitt began to act, first through the usual channels, delaying approvals, raising questions about documentation, and making technical objections that required additional verification. These were all legitimate tools, and he used them masterfully. Work on the Do-335 progressed but slowly, significantly slower than it should have. In parallel, something else happened. In 1942, Messerschmitt presented his own project for a high-speed aircraft. It received the designation ME-231, and those who saw both projects immediately noticed a strange coincidence. The layout was tandem, two engines along the axis of the fuselage, a cruciform tail unit. The cockpit layout put the pilot between the engines. Even some structural components repeated solutions from Dornier's 1937 patent. Dornier filed an official complaint. When technical experts compared the two projects in detail, the similarities turned out to be too precise to be explained by accidental parallel engineering development. In aircraft manufacturing, it does happen that different designers arrive at similar solutions independently. But here, it was not about similar solutions. It was about specific details, unique angles, and unconventional joints, things that are not derived from general principles, but are designed by a specific person at a specific moment. The investigation confirmed. The ME-231 was created based on materials from Dornier's project. How exactly these materials ended up with Messerschmitt remained officially unresolved. The distribution system for technical documentation in the German aviation industry was set up so that large enterprises had access to a wide range of industry developments. This was done for coordination, to avoid duplication. In practice, it meant that other people's blueprints were not that difficult to obtain. The ME-231 project was canceled, officially for technical reasons. For Dornier, this was a victory, but it came at a high cost. Several months of work were lost in bureaucratic disputes. And time in 1942 carried a price that is hard to overestimate. Messerschmitt did not disappear. He stepped back and began working on another project, a fully jet-powered one. This project was called the ME-262, and it was this aircraft that ultimately became the main competitor to the Do-335. Not in a technical sense, but in the struggle for priority, resources, and the attention of the decision-makers. But that would come later. For now, the copying scandal unexpectedly gave Dornier what he had lacked all this time: room to work. A quiet environment in which he could finally build. And in 1943, his machine took to the air for the first time. October 1943. The test airfield in Lechfeld, southern Germany. Morning, the air is cold and still. The kind that only happens in autumn, when there is no wind yet but the warmth is already gone. On the runway stands a machine that most of those present are seeing for the first time. The Do-335 looks different from anything that had stood on this airfield before. A long, elongated fuselage, almost a needle, a three-blade tractor propeller in the front, and an identical pusher propeller in the back. The cruciform tail unit juts out to the sides and downward, with the lower fin almost touching the ground. The cockpit is shifted backward relative to the usual position. The pilot sits literally between two engines. The mechanics have finished the pre-flight check. Both engines, Daimler-Benz 603s producing 1,750 horsepower each, are started. The sound is unusual. Two synchronously operating motors produce a steady, low hum, with almost none of the uneven pulse typical of piston-engine aircraft. Those who stood nearby later said it sounded like a large sea vessel, not an airplane. At the controls is test pilot Hans Zuber, an experienced pilot who had flown dozens of different machines. These are exactly the kind of people needed for a first flight, not those who admire, but those who observe and record. The takeoff run. The machine gained speed quickly, noticeably faster than observers on the ground expected. Two engines with a total output of 3,500 horsepower accelerate the aircraft with almost no effort. Liftoff. The Do-335 climbs at an angle that, for a machine of this size, looks almost incredible. The first minutes follow a standard program: climbing, checking controllability, and test maneuvers. Zuber would later say that the aircraft responded to control inputs more precisely than he had anticipated. There was no vibration from the two counter-rotating propellers. Dornier's engineers solved this problem by synchronizing the engine speeds. Then, the high-speed run began. The Do-335 was accelerated on the test route to its maximum setting. The recorded speed in level flight was 765 kilometers per hour. To put it in perspective, the best production fighter of the time, the Focke-Wulf 190, developed about 650 kilometers per hour under similar conditions. The Do-335 was faster by over 100 kilometers per hour. This was not a minor advantage, it was a different category. On the third test flight, an experiment was conducted that was discussed for a long time afterward. Zuber, at an altitude of 4,000 meters, intentionally shut down the front engine. Completely. Stop. Propeller feathered. The aircraft continued its flight on the rear engine alone. The speed dropped to 560 kilometers per hour, but the stability did not change. No yawing moment, no roll, no struggle with the controls. The airplane flew straight and level. This was a fundamental point. In a conventional twin-engine aircraft, when one engine fails, asymmetrical thrust occurs. The machine yawns to one side, the pilot is forced to counter this with the rudders, and the control load increases sharply. In a critical situation, at low altitude or during landing, this could be fatal. The Do-335 did not have this problem in principle. Both engines were located on the same axis. The failure of either did not create asymmetrical thrust. Dornier observed the tests personally. He was 59 years old. He had worked toward this moment for more than 6 years, through rejections, bureaucracy, and others' intrigues. What he thought while watching his machine in the sky is not recorded. But those who were near him said he was very quiet that day. He just looked up and remained silent. There were, of course, drawbacks. Forward visibility from the cockpit was limited by the front engine and its cowling. The pilot saw less than in a conventional fighter. The rear propeller presented a serious danger to the pilot during an emergency ejection, as they could be struck by a blade. Dornier was already working on a system to jettison the rear propeller and tail fin before ejection. This was a solvable problem. Everything was solvable. The machine worked. The machine flew. While the Do-335 was undergoing testing in Lechfeld, completely different conversations were taking place in Berlin. Not about aerodynamics or engine characteristics, but about politics. About whose project would receive funding, whose name would appear in the report to the leadership, and whose machine would be placed in the priority production plan. This was 1943. The situation in the air over Europe had changed radically compared to 1940. The Allies were increasingly active over German territory. A response was needed, fast, convincing, and preferably something that could be beautifully presented as a technological breakthrough. Messerschmitt had been working on a jet aircraft for a long time. The Me-262, a twin-engine jet fighter, had existed in prototype form since 1941. The program was progressing with difficulty. The jet engines of the time were unreliable, their service life was measured in single-digit hours, and the technology was unrefined. But visually, the machine looked like the future. Swept wings, jet engines slung beneath them, and a speed that in theory exceeded everything in existence. The phrase, "in theory," is key here. When the test results of the Do-335 reached the German command, the reaction was mixed. The numbers were impressive. 765 kilometers per hour with a piston engine was hard to ignore. Controllability on a single engine was a major practical argument. The machine was ready for mass production much sooner than the Me-262. But the Do-335 had one flaw that had nothing to do with technology. Dornier was behind it, not Messerschmitt. By the time information about the Do-335 reached the upper leadership of the German Air Force, Messerschmitt had already done his work, not in the sky, but in the offices. The Me-262 was presented as a new generation machine, a qualitative leap forward, something that existed nowhere else in the world. A piston aircraft, even the fastest in history, naturally looked like yesterday's news next to a jet. At the end of 1943, a decision was made. The Me-262 received the status of a priority project. All resources, all production capacities, and all attention went there. The Do-335 was relegated to the category of a reserve project. This meant work was not banned, but funding was cut. Production lines were not allocated, and no deadlines were set. In practice, this meant one thing: there would be no mass production. Dornier understood this immediately. He had already gone through this scenario once, back in 1940. But back then, he did not have a flying prototype with documented performance characteristics. Now he did, and it changed nothing. The decision was not made based on technical data. This is important to understand. It was not because the Do-335 was worse. It was not because it had unresolvable issues. It was because in a system where personal connections carried more weight than engineering calculations, Dornier's machine lost to Messerschmitt's, regardless of what the test showed. The Me-262, at the time the decision was made, had serious unresolved problems. The engines failed after a few hours of operation. Takeoff and landing characteristics were dangerous. Pilots transitioning from piston aircraft to jets required lengthy retraining. Production demanded materials and technologies that were chronically scarce. But none of these problems sounded loud enough in the right offices, and the technical advantages of the Do-335 did not sound loud enough in those same offices. Dornier continued to work. He brought the Do-335 to a state where the machine could be put into series production at any moment. He resolved the visibility issue from the cockpit. He developed an emergency ejection system that jettisoned the rear propeller, a solution that engineers around the world would later study. He did everything right. It was just that in this story, doing things right was not enough. 14. That is exactly how many aircraft were built under the Do-335 program. Not 14,000, 14 individual aircraft. For comparison, the Focke-Wulf 190, the primary German fighter of that period, was produced in quantities exceeding 20,000 units. The Me-262, which received all priorities and resources, saw about 1,400 machines built, though significantly fewer were actually combat-ready. The Do-335 had only 14. This was not the result of technical problems. The factory in Oberpfaffenhofen, where the machines were produced, was operational. Workers were there, blueprints were there, materials, though in limited quantities, were available. The production line simply never received the status that would allow manufacturing to expand properly. The final aircraft were assembled under conditions where the very existence of production was in question. Spring of 1945. Allied forces were moving through France and into the western regions of Germany. Allied aviation operated over industrial sites almost without restriction. Factories changed their work routines, hiding equipment, moving production underground, and working at night. Under these conditions, assembling an airplane was an achievement in itself. But every assembled machine remained on the ground. Not one of the 14 was ever used in actual combat against an adversary. Not a single mission. Not a single engagement. The fastest piston fighter in history never met another aircraft in the sky. This is difficult to comprehend rationally. 6 years of development, brilliant test results, complete technical readiness, and yet, silence. When American troops entered the factory grounds in Oberpfaffenhofen in May 1945, they found several Do-335s in various stages of completion. Some of the aircraft had been intentionally disabled before the retreat, a standard practice of the time. But several airplanes remained virtually intact. American engineers from technical teams, who followed the troops specifically to study captured equipment, examined the machines carefully. Then, very carefully. Then they requested additional time and specialists. One of the engineers involved in the inspection later wrote a sentence in a report that many aviation historians would go on to quote. He wrote something along the lines of, "The structural solutions of this aircraft are at a level we did not expect to see in a production or near production machine. A number of components will require separate study." Several examples of the Do-335 were shipped to the United States for detailed evaluation. American test pilots flew the machines at Wright Field in Ohio. The reports of these flights, classified documents released much later, contain assessments that sound almost astonishing. The machine was described as exceptionally pleasant to handle, with characteristics surpassing anything the test pilots had encountered in the piston engine class. One Do-335 ended up in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution. This is the very example that stands today in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. It was restored and preserved as one of the most technologically significant aircraft of that period. The other machines did not survive. They were dismantled, studied, used as sources of information, and scrapped. Such was the fate of most captured technology. 14 airplanes, one in a museum, the rest in archival reports and in the memory of the people who saw them. Dornier survived all of this. He continued to work after the end of the conflict, again in Spain, again outside Germany, again building flying boats. He never publicly spoke of the Do-335 with bitterness, at least not in any words preserved in records. But the legacy left by his machine turned out to be longer lasting than it seemed in 1945. In Washington, on the National Mall, stands a building of glass and metal. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, one of the most visited museums in the world. Each year, about 8 million people pass through its halls. Here is the Apollo 11 capsule that flew to the moon. Here is the Wright brothers' Flyer, the first powered aircraft in history. There are fighters, bombers, and experimental machines. And here, in one of the halls, stands the Do-335. It is painted in dark green, the standard finish for German aviation of that period. Below it is an information plaque. The plaque states that this is the only surviving complete example of the aircraft, that it was captured by American forces in 1945, that it is one of the most technically significant aircraft of the Second World War. Most visitors read the plaque and move on, but those who linger, who walk around the machine, who look at the cruciform tail, the two propellers, the elongated needle-like fuselage, frequently return. Something about this aircraft does not let go. Perhaps it is a sense of incompleteness. The airplane looks as if it is ready to fly, as if it were not put on display as a historical artifact, but simply parked for a short while before its next flight. That flight never took place. But the ideas Dornier put into this machine did not remain in that museum hall. The tandem engine layout became the subject of serious study in several countries after 1945. American engineers working with the captured Do-335s compiled detailed technical reports. These reports found their way into design bureaus, aviation institutes, and educational curricula. In the 1950s, the experimental consolidated Vultee XP-81 was developed in the United States. It utilized a mixed-power propulsion system, a piston engine in the front and a jet engine in the tail. This was precisely the hybrid scheme Dornier had proposed back in 1942, the very one he conceived to appeal to Goering. The Americans arrived at it independently, but the Do-335 in their archives had already been studied in detail by then. In the 60s and 70s, the tandem layout re-emerged in several experimental designs as a way to obtain high thrust without increasing frontal drag. The logic was the same as Dornier's. Two engines on a single axis provide the combined power of a twin-engine aircraft within the aerodynamic profile of a single-engine one. The cruciform tail design took on a life of its own. Dornier came up with it as a necessary measure. It was essential to place the lower vertical stabilizer low enough to prevent the rear propeller from hitting the ground during landing. This solution proved so aerodynamically successful that it was adopted and applied in various modifications for decades. The emergency ejection system with a jettisonable rear propeller, developed by Dornier to address pilot safety during egress, became a distinct chapter in the history of aviation safety. The principle of forcibly separating a hazardous structural element before pilot ejection was subsequently applied and continues to be used in various aircraft in different forms. Claudius Dornier himself returned to work after 1945, first in Spain and then back in Germany once the restrictions on aircraft manufacturing were lifted. He founded a new company, continued to design aircraft, lived to the age of 85, and passed away in 1969 in Zug, Switzerland. The Do-335 was rarely mentioned in his public interviews. He spoke of the future, of new projects, and of how aviation had not yet said its last word. But everyone who knew him closely said the same thing. He remembered this machine. Always. 14 airplanes, one in a museum, and ideas that live on in designs whose origins most people will never know. This is the true legacy of the Do-335. Not an exhibit under glass, but an idea that continues to work, quietly, without a plaque bearing the author's name. There is a question that arises for anyone who has seriously studied the history of the Do-335. It is not historical in the strict sense. Historicists work with what was, not what might have been. But it is a human question, and it is hard to dismiss. What would have happened if the machine had gone into mass production? Not in 1945, when it was already too late, but in 43, when the test showed results, when the factory was ready, and when the decision could still have been made differently. Let's start with numbers, because without them, this conversation turns into fantasy. The speed of the Do-335 in level flight was 765 kilometers per hour. The British Mosquito, which caused the German Air Force so much trouble, reached about 650 kilometers per hour in its best modifications. The difference? 115 kilometers per hour. In aviation, this is a massive margin. An aircraft that is faster by 115 kilometers per hour does not just catch up with an opponent, it chooses whether to engage or not. It controls the situation. The American heavy bomber, the Boeing B-17, which was used for raids on Germany's industrial targets, flew at about 460 kilometers per hour. The Do-335 was nearly twice as fast. But speed is only one characteristic. What matters more is something else. The Do-335 was ready for mass production sooner than the Me-262. Production of the Daimler-Benz 603 piston engines was already established. These motors were installed in other aircraft, and the technology was proven. The jet engines for the Me-262, by contrast, required rare materials and complex manufacturing processes that the German industry struggled to manage under the conditions of 1943 and 44. The service life of the early Jumo 004 jet engines used on the Me-262 was about 25 hours. The Daimler-Benz 603 engines on the Do-335 had a service life several times longer. These are not abstract figures. An engine with a 25-hour service life is an engine that must be replaced after every few flights. Under the conditions of material and production shortages, this meant a significant portion of the Me-262 fleet was constantly undergoing maintenance. Aviation historians who have studied this period in detail, specifically the British researcher Alfred Price and the American historian Mike Spick, point to a paradox. The Me-262, which was positioned as a technological marvel, in practice had operational readiness significantly lower than what a production piston machine with mature engines could have achieved. The Do-335 in mass production from 1943 could hypothetically have yielded several hundred aircraft by mid-44. With performance characteristics confirmed by tests, with engines already in production, with pilots who did not require specialized retraining to transition from other piston aircraft. One aviation historian, whose name appears in several independent sources in connection with this topic, formulated a thought that has since been frequently cited. He said something like, "The Do-335 is the only aircraft of that period whose fate is discussed with regret by researchers on both sides of the front line, because it was simply a very good machine, regardless of who built it and when." This is a rare assessment, and it says something important. Technology has no nationality. An engineering solution, good or bad, remains as such regardless of the context in which it appeared. The Do-335 was a good solution. This is recognized by everyone who has studied it. But here it is important to stop and say directly, we do not know what exactly the appearance of a larger number of these machines in the sky would have changed. History does not work like an equation where you can replace one variable and get a different result. There are too many factors, too many people, and too many decisions being made simultaneously in different places. What we do know for sure is different. There was a machine, it worked, it was not released, and this fact in itself, without any alternative histories, already speaks to something important. Not about aviation, but about how systems where decisions are made are structured. About how the correct answer and the accepted answer are not always the same thing. Dornier knew this. He lived with this knowledge for the rest of his life. Claudius Dornier lived 85 years. He was born in 1884 in a Bavarian town, the son of a French merchant and a German mother. He passed away in 1969 in Zug, Switzerland, a recognized engineer, the founder of a company whose name was carried by dozens of aircraft. By that time, man had already been to space. Jet airliners carried passengers across oceans. The world in which Dornier began working, the world of airships and flying boats, had vanished so completely that it seemed almost mythical. He witnessed all of this, and he continued to work almost to the very end. After 1945, his path followed a familiar route, abroad again, to where he could work without restrictions. Spain welcomed him just as it had in the 20s. He founded a new company, designed new machines, and trained young engineers. In 1954, when Germany was granted the right to civilian aircraft manufacturing, he returned and opened an enterprise at home once again. He was asked about the Do-335 only rarely. Journalists preferred to ask about the flying boats, the famous Wall, and the pre-war long-distance flight records. The Do-335 was an uncomfortable topic, too closely associated with a period that Germany in the 50s and 60s preferred not to discuss unnecessarily. In those few interviews where this aircraft was mentioned, Dornier answered briefly. He said the machine was good, that he regretted how things turned out. That an engineer does his job, builds, calculates, tests, and the rest does not depend on him. It did not sound like bitterness. It sounded like a weary understanding. There is a special category of people, those who arrive too early. Not in terms of age, but in terms of ideas. They see a solution before those around them are ready to accept it. And they have to wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, until the world grows to match what they devised long ago. Dornier waited from 1937 to 1942, 5 years with a completed patent in his desk. Then another year to fight for the competition. Then another 2 years for testing and production under conditions where every decision was made in the wrong place. He received his recognition, but not for the machine he considered his best. This is a familiar story, not because it happens often to aircraft designers, but because it happens to people in general. To those who devise something genuine within a system that is not equipped to appreciate it in time. The correct solution and the accepted solution diverge not because people are malicious or foolish. They diverge because systems are slow, because personal interests are real, and because the fear of the new is stronger than the interest in it. Dornier knew this from 1940, and he kept working. What is important is not that he lost, but that he did not stop. The rejection in 1940, he continued. The blueprint copying scandal, he continued. The decision on reserve status, he continued. The end of production at 14 machines, he continued. He built the next aircraft, always the next one. This is the answer to the question that hangs over this entire story. Not why did it not succeed, we have already analyzed that, but what to do with it. Dornier's answer was simple: build the next thing. In that museum hall in Washington, the Do-335 stands in silence. 8 million people a year pass by. Some stop. They look at the 2 propellers, the cruciform tail, and the long needle-like fuselage. They read the plaque. The plaque says a lot, but there is one thing it does not say. It does not say how many times the man who designed this machine heard the word no and returned with a new blueprint. That would not fit on a plaque. It is difficult to put into words at all. The airplane stands. The light falls on the dark green fuselage. The 2 propellers are still. It never got to fly its fill, but it remained.